Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Joshua. We're still looking at the end of Joshua chapter 11. Now, the latter part of chapter 11, as we've seen the last couple of sessions, is a summary of the conquest of the land, the conquering of the promised land. And we've dealt with sort of the problem areas where certain portions of the land were totally devoted to destruction. The biblical word for that is they were placed under the ban. That means they were totally devoted to destruction. Now, I've already seen this did not include all the land or all the population. That is a mistake. But there were certain areas, certain cities, certain territories that were completely devoted to destruction. And we saw that these areas were those that contained the Anakites, or the sons of Anak. Now that's in verses 21 through 22 of chapter 11. Let's read that again. So at that time Joshua went, he destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron and Debir and Anab, from the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. So this total destruction was in the area where the Anakites lived. And then we asked in yesterday's session, well, who were the Anakites? Well, for that, we had to look back to Numbers 13, 40 years before, when Moses had sent the spies into the land of Canaan. And they came back with a good report, except they said, we cannot take the land. At least 10 of them said that. They said, we cannot take the land because giants are there, and we can't defeat them. And then we saw that these giants, and when you read in Numbers 13, were the descendants of Anak. They were the Anakites. They were also descendants of the Nephilim. So now, 40 years later, when they're taking the land, these people, these giants, also called the descendants of Anak, or the Nephilim, had to be totally destroyed. And it says Joshua did that. When the conquest was over, there were no Anakites left in the land. Now, who are the Nephilim from which these Anakites were descended? Why was their sin so grievous that they had to be placed under total destruction, under the ban in the biblical word? Well, to understand that, you have to go back to Genesis chapter 6 and the great sin that produced the Nephilim. So let's turn to Genesis chapter 6, the first few verses. It says, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever. They are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. These were men of renown. But the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And then, of course, as we read on, it comes to the judgment of God upon the people, that is the great flood in Noah's day. Now, the flood, the judgment of God, the wrath of God is linked with these Nephilim, this great sin that produced the Nephilim. And then when we get to Numbers, there are still the descendants of the Nephilim in the land, the Anakites. And then in the conquest, this sin must be eradicated and the consequences of it. So it is the Nephilim, those areas that are placed under the ban, not the entire population. That is an erroneous understanding. Places that were put under the ban, devoted to total destruction, were where there were the Nephilim. And God said, this line has to be eradicated. This great sin has to be removed from the place where my people dwell. And so it says when the conquest was over, that had been accomplished. There were no Anakites left in the land. But did you notice that one verse that says some of them escaped to non-Israelite territories, to Gaza and Gath and Ashkelon. Those are the areas of the Philistines. It would be years later before we see the Nephilim again living among the Philistines. You remember when David had his great battle with Goliath. It says Goliath was a giant. In other words, he was one of the descendants of Anak. He was one of the Nephilim. And so it was left to David to finally eradicate the last of the Nephilim. And that began with his great battle with Goliath. But that, of course, is found later in the scripture record. Right now we're looking at Joshua. And so Joshua has accomplished his mission. The land of Israel has been cleared of the sin of the Nephilim. And the areas devoted to total destruction were simply those areas, the areas where the Nephilim lived. Okay, now tomorrow we'll move on to the next chapter in the next episode in the book of Joshua. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in this book of Joshua.